All right. I added this image in this morning to help us all imagine a bright and sunny fall day. Thank you all for being here. I also want to thank Kevin Conlon and his team for getting me here, but also for organizing this convention and for keeping such a tight ship. I want to talk about learning things, and I hope that my presentation will make this clear in the end. Learning things really as something that combines multiple aspects of what learning means and how it happens. And I come to this from two sides. One is my professional practice, where we design and produce furniture for all sorts of applications, and particularly in the last few years for learning spaces, studios, and libraries. And the second angle is my experience and practice as an educator at the University of the Arts, where I'm part of a team that promotes human-centered and participatory design and design for social impact. I want to talk about three things. The first being what is a learning space, and I know this is a huge discussion, so I'm just going to touch on a few things. The second, I want to share some observations, again, from both of my sides, from the one of a designer and producer, but also from the other as an educator. And lastly, I want to make a case for organizing learning things on a broader scale. So what is a successful learning space? For one, it was said here several times today already, and I'm going to race through this very quickly. We're learning no longer from the world, but we're learning in the world. And it's a very interesting challenge to then bring this down to a local level and how to frame work. This is our campus at UArts in Center City, Philadelphia. It's about objects, performative objects, all this stuff that's necessary to actually learn and do things, and I think that gets more and more interesting as classrooms are no longer very static, but become increasingly dynamic and move around and change all the time. It's about academics or pedagogy, and this is actually a studio I ran last spring, and as you can see here, it's people working together. The faculty steps back, is really in a facilitator role, and it's a lot about peer learning, and it's about learning in the collective. And it's about people and collaboration, and I think there's a lot to be done and looked into in how we collaborate. I think we encourage people to do that, but increasingly as we collaborate not only within the studio and fellow students, but also as we collaborate more and more with outside entities, this becomes a bigger and bigger issue to be addressed. And there's process. And process not only now for professional designers, but also process that helps non-designers to be integrated into the design process. And I added Liz Sanders' graph here about co-creative strategies and process. And it's about technology, of course, which is a huge issue, and I don't want to get too deep into that now. So the point I want to make, and why I did this, is that we're looking at a system, and a system that is fairly complex and involved, and a system that requires system tools and strategies to be innovated and addressed. So that gets me to some observations. One is that's how it typically starts. That's the boundary object, the reference that's being produced to explain how a space comes about and how it functions. And I would consider this, or I consider this to be a very limited tool, which then often very quickly leads to issues because people cannot understand what other people are saying because they come from different disciplines, speak different languages, have a different culture. And this is a shot from a planning meeting for a new floor that our department moved into a few years ago. The typical suspects, here the architect, facilities manager, chief operations manager, and the client rep have the conversation, and the conversation doesn't really include the actual users, the students, the faculty. I was there because I was directing a program, but again, the limitation is really that these discussions cannot just happen at a table, they have to have a different forum. And lastly, once a space is complete, and the planning team has long been disassembled, there's very little infrastructure or scaffolding that will allow people that use this space to actually be informed and aware about the space and also understand how they can iterate and upgrade that. Which gets me to learning things. And things originally in early societies, pre-Christian Nordic Germanic societies in part, a thing was not meant to address and define an object. A thing was actually a moment where people came together to argue or discuss or make decisions. And interesting also in that context is that they were facilitators that had special knowledge in order to make this process run well. And my case, or the way I interpret for my interpretation of this, is that I would like to create a program, and I'm in the process of doing that, that offers different stages, workshops in different formats that allow people, to discover or rediscover in the way how they use space, but also then address certain problems and begin to quickly prototype. And I'm going to show some examples of that. The first two examples are from a planning process before people actually moved into the space, and the last one is an example of an intervention that happened after people moved in and began to use. Whoops. Okay, so this was the first one was an issue at the University of the Arts, where we are in the process of reorganizing the university and we built a school for design, and the question was how can the faculty at the School of Design begin to have a conversation about what the school is and how many concentrations there should be. And the way we answered that was, or we approached that was, we formatted each of these competencies that were collected onto cards, and then had a lunch meeting with people, with the faculty group to organize those cards, prioritize those cards, and then present them to each other. And the outcome of that was were these 4 boards, which not necessarily offered an answer to the issue, but at least began to have a different conversation. And the fact that people had to get out of their chairs, were not just sitting around conference tables and talking, but had a very active exchange among each other, I thought was a progress. The second project I'd like to show was a project at Williams College, where the college was planning a new central library, and the architects, Bolin, Savinsky, Jackson, came up with very fine ideas and floor plans. But again, the question was, so by the time this building opens in 5 years, how do we know what people will actually do? And we were able to convince the architects and organization to give some spaces in an existing library and create some test sites that would kind of engage some of those hot potatoes that were in the room, which were like library, you can't have any food or coffee there, or in a liberal arts context, was really not understood how important it could be to introduce studio elements like whiteboards, tack walls, etc. And these things were up for a while. We tried different things, and we also had a lot of participation from faculty, students, librarians, staff, and they were able to vote. There were public forums, and then some of these ideas eventually flew into or made it into the final design of the library that opened this fall. And the last example I want to give is at MICA, where we furnished a new Center for Social Design. And the question there was, it's a 1-year program, an MFA program with other projects attached to it. How do people use the space, and how can they be more aware of the space? And in this case, this was also in parallel with stuff that we did at Parsons. We began to develop a more formal kit that has certain prompts, activities. This was an instruction on, these are the stickers that maybe articulate what you do in the studio. This is over there ways you might feel in the studio. And the activity later on was for students to take a floor plan and then address where they do certain things. So it begins with writing, very individual. Then there's this hands-on activity of mapping out everyday paths. Then a readout where people begin to share stories and exchange experiences, followed by contextual interviews, individual interviews where people can share how their journey through the studio, through the space every day. We assigned for the rest of the semester this exercise where people get cards and then are asked to essentially take photographs as they go through their week, through the space, to indicate how they feel, how they connect to the space. And those photographs are now uploaded on Pinterest. And the idea is really to have a more shared viewing of how people use the space. And after making sense out of all the data that we got in writing through the Pinterest postings, we developed a second stage, which now combines all the learning, breaks it down into certain key issues, and asks then students to come together now in teams to brainstorm and to begin prototyping. And I want to thank you for that. 10 minutes is very short, obviously, to address this, so if you have any ideas or questions, please see me outside, and I look forward to that. Thank you.